August 29th, 1944, somewhere in France. General George S. Patton Jr. is standing in front of a map, and he's furious. His Third Army has just accomplished something unprecedented. They've driven 400 miles across France in less than a month. They've liberated Paris. They've destroyed multiple German divisions. They're within striking distance of the German border. And now they're stopped dead. Not by German resistance, not by superior enemy forces, not by tactical mistakes. They're stopped because they've run out of gasoline. Patton's tanks, his beloved M4 Shermans, are sitting immobile across eastern France. His artillery has no ammunition. His troops are on half rations. The most successful military advance in modern warfare has ground to a halt because of logistics. The US Army had planned to be in Paris by D-Day plus 90. Patton got there in 79 days. The supply lines, the trucks, the fuel, the depots were designed for an army moving slowly, methodically, according to plan. But Patton never moved according to plan. Now his Third Army is paralyzed, and the war, which could potentially be won by Christmas if Patton can keep advancing, is slipping away. Patton needs a miracle. He needs someone to move more supplies, faster, across more distance than any military logistics operation in history. What he gets is the Red Ball Express. 6,000 truck drivers, 3/4 of them black men who the army didn't trust to fight, who are about to do the impossible. They're going to move 12,500 tons of supplies every single day across France. They're going to drive 24 hours a day without relief, some going 72 hours without sleep. They're going to keep Patton's army moving when every logistics expert said it couldn't be done. This is the story of how 6,000 truck drivers became the secret weapon that won World War II in Europe. This is the story of men who weren't allowed in combat, proving they were just as essential as the soldiers firing the guns. This is the story of the Red Ball Express. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're watching from. To understand why the Red Ball Express became necessary, you need to understand what Patton did in the summer of 1944, and why it shouldn't have been possible. D-Day, June 6, 1944. Allied forces land in Normandy. The plan is methodical. Establish a beachhead, build up forces, slowly push inland. The logistics officers have calculated everything: fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, ration requirements. They've designed supply lines to support an army advancing 10 to 15 miles per day. Then, Operation Cobra launches on July 25th, the Allied breakout from Normandy, and suddenly everything changes. Patton's Third Army doesn't advance 10 to 15 miles per day. They advance 50 miles, then 70 miles. In one 48-hour period, Patton's armored divisions cover 100 miles, faster than the German Blitzkrieg in 1940. The German army in France collapses. Entire divisions surrender. The Wehrmacht is in full retreat. For a brief moment in August 1944, it looks like the Allies might win the war in weeks instead of months. But the Allied logistics system can't keep up. Here's the problem. Everything, every bullet, every gallon of fuel, every ration pack, every spare part has to come from the beaches in Normandy. There are no captured French ports yet. Everything comes across the invasion beaches or through the temporary Mulberry harbors. From Normandy to Paris is 200 miles. From Normandy to where Patton's army stops in late August is over 400 miles. Every supply truck has to drive 800 miles round trip just to deliver one load. The army's logistics plan assumed they'd capture major French ports, Le Havre, Brest, Marseille, and use those to bring supplies closer to the front. But those ports were still held by Germans or had been destroyed in the fighting. Everything still had to come from Normandy. Do the math. Patton's Third Army needs roughly 400,000 gallons of gasoline per day just to move. That's 50 tanker trucks worth every single day, plus ammunition, food, spare parts, medical supplies. The army estimated they needed to deliver about 20,000 tons of supplies daily to support operations in France. They were delivering about 7,000 tons. The supply system was designed for an army near the beaches. Patton was 400 miles inland. The supply trucks couldn't make enough round trips. Traffic was chaotic. There weren't enough vehicles. The whole system was breaking down. By late August, Patton's tanks were running on fumes. His artillery battalions were rationing shells. Soldiers were on reduced rations. The great advance, the push that could win the war, was dying not from enemy action, but from empty gas tanks. General Omar Bradley, Patton's superior, visited the Third Army in late August. He found Patton almost in tears. "Give me 400,000 gallons of gasoline," Patton said, "and I'll be in Germany in 2 days." Bradley didn't have 400,000 gallons to give him. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice. The logistics system couldn't support multiple armies advancing simultaneously. He had to choose: give fuel to British Field Marshal Montgomery's forces in the north or give it to Patton in the south. Eisenhower chose Montgomery. Patton's advance stopped. And that's when someone came up with a desperate idea: the Red Ball Express. Take every available truck, every driver, every vehicle that could roll. Put them on dedicated routes, highways cleared of all other traffic, marked with red balls, running 24 hours a day. Run them like railroad trains. Constant motion, no stops, maximum priority. Drive the trucks until they break. Drive the drivers until they collapse. Move supplies faster than the logistics manual said was possible. It was a gamble born of desperation. It violated every principle of sustainable logistics. It would burn out men and machines. But it might, just might, keep Patton's army moving long enough to reach Germany before winter. On August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express began operations. In the next 83 days, it would move 412,000 tons of supplies. It would keep multiple Allied armies advancing, and it would prove that 6,000 men, most of them black soldiers the army didn't think were capable of combat, could outwork, outperform, and outendure any logistics operation in military history. The Red Ball Express would eventually involve over 6,000 drivers and support personnel. About 75% of them were black soldiers. This wasn't an accident. This was the result of systematic racism in how the U.S. Army assigned black soldiers during World War II. In 1944, the U.S. Army had over 700,000 black soldiers in uniform. The vast majority, about 80%, were assigned to service and supply units, Quartermaster Corps, Transportation Corps, engineer battalions, port companies, not combat, almost never combat. The Army's official position was that black soldiers lacked the intelligence, discipline, and courage for combat roles. This wasn't just prejudice. It was written into military doctrine. Black soldiers were systematically channeled into support roles, loading ships, driving trucks, building roads, handling supplies. The irony is profound. The Army didn't trust black men to fight, but it trusted them to keep the entire war machine running. The men who drove for the Red Ball Express came from every corner of black America. Some were from southern farms, men who'd grown up driving trucks on cotton plantations or in lumber camps. They knew how to handle heavy vehicles on bad roads. They could fix engines with improvised parts. They could drive all day and all night if necessary. Others were from northern cities, Detroit, Chicago, New York. They'd worked in factories, driven delivery trucks, operated machinery. They brought mechanical skills and urban toughness. Some had college educations. Some couldn't read. Some were professional drivers in civilian life. Others had never driven anything bigger than a Ford Model T until the Army taught them. What united them was this: they'd all volunteered to serve their country, and their country had responded by telling them they weren't good enough to fight. One driver, later interviewed by historians, said, "We wanted to be infantry. We wanted to be tankers. We wanted to prove we could fight. Instead, they put us in trucks. But you know what? We decided we'd prove ourselves anyway. If they wanted us to drive, we'd drive better than anyone else ever had." The training for Red Ball drivers was minimal. Most had received basic truck driving instruction: how to operate a 2.5-ton, deuce-and-a-half cargo truck, how to drive in convoy, how to perform basic maintenance. But nobody trained them for what they were about to do: drive 20-hour shifts, navigate bombed-out roads, operate under constant pressure, keep going when exhaustion made your eyes cross and your hands shake. They learned all that on the job. The trucks themselves were workhorses: GMC CKW 2.5-ton 6x6 cargo trucks. Jimmy trucks, the drivers called them. They were reliable, powerful, and could handle rough terrain. Each one could carry 5,000 pounds of cargo: ammunition, fuel, rations, medical supplies, spare parts, whatever the front needed. But they weren't comfortable. No power steering. Loud, bone-shaking ride on rough roads. In summer, the cab was an oven. In rain, drivers got soaked because the canvas covers leaked. The seats were hard. The gear shift was stiff. After 10 hours of driving, your back ached, your arms felt like lead, and your legs cramped. The Red Ball drivers would drive for 20 hours at a stretch. Some went 48 hours. A few went 72 hours, sleeping in brief intervals between runs, staying awake through sheer will and sometimes amphetamines that medics distributed. The routes were marked with red balls painted on signs every few miles, hence the name Red Ball Express. These routes were designated highways, cleared of civilian traffic and given absolute priority. If you saw the red ball signs, you got out of the way. Everything else stopped for the Red Ball. The convoys ran day and night. Drivers navigated by keeping one hand on the wheel and watching the taillights of the truck ahead. At night, they drove with blackout lights, dim slits that barely illuminated the road, to avoid German bombers. During the day, they drove at maximum speed, sometimes 50 to 60 miles per hour on straightaways, ignoring the posted limits because speed meant supplies reached the front faster. They drove through bombed-out towns where buildings still smoldered. They drove past destroyed German vehicles and dead bodies. They drove through towns where French civilians lined the roads, cheering and throwing flowers. They drove through rain that turned roads to mud. They drove through heat that made the steering wheel too hot to touch. And they drove when they were so exhausted they started hallucinating. One driver later recalled, "After 18 hours, you'd see things. Shadows that looked like people, trees that seemed to move. Your eyes would close for just a second and you'd jerk awake, heart pounding, realizing the truck had drifted halfway off the road." Another said, "You'd pull into the supply depot, get loaded, and fall asleep waiting for the paperwork. 5 minutes later, they'd wake you, and you'd be back on the road. There was no rest. There couldn't be. If we stopped, the war stopped." The Army's official stance was that drivers should work 8-hour shifts with rest periods between runs. That was the regulation. The reality was that drivers often worked until they physically couldn't continue. When one driver collapsed, another would take his truck and keep going. The Red Ball ran on exhaustion and determination in equal measure. But here's what's remarkable. They didn't complain. Or rather, they complained about the conditions, the exhaustion, the lack of sleep. But they didn't quit. They didn't slow down. They didn't ask to be reassigned because they knew what was at stake. And they knew they were proving something. Every time a Red Ball convoy rolled into a frontline supply depot, combat soldiers, white combat soldiers, would stop and stare. The infantry would see these trucks arriving, loaded with ammunition and fuel and food, and they'd know that someone had just driven hundreds of miles through the night without rest to make sure they could keep fighting. And slowly, grudgingly, respect developed. The combat troops began to understand that these black drivers were keeping them alive, that without the Red Ball Express, there was no advance, no victory, no going home. The Red Ball Express operated from August 25th to November 16th, 1944, 83 days of continuous operations. In that time, it transported 412,000 tons of supplies. That's the equivalent of 165,000 fully loaded trucks, making the round trip from Normandy to the front lines. It worked because 6,000 men decided they would not fail. They would not be the reason the advance stopped. They would prove that black soldiers could outperform anyone's expectations. They became Patton's secret weapon, not because they were soldiers, but because they refused to be anything less than exceptional. Let me tell you about what it actually means to drive 72 hours without sleep. The human body isn't designed for this. After 24 hours without sleep, your cognitive function is equivalent to being legally drunk. Your reaction time slows, your judgment becomes impaired, you start making mistakes. After 48 hours, you begin to experience micro-sleeps, brief moments where your brain shuts down for a few seconds, whether you want it to or not. You can be driving, eyes open, and suddenly you're unconscious for 3 to 5 seconds. At 40 miles per hour, you travel 200 feet in that time, the length of half a football field, driven completely blind. After 72 hours, hallucinations begin. Your brain, desperate for rest, starts creating sensory experiences that aren't real. You see people who aren't there. You hear voices. The road seems to move in ways that don't make sense. This is what the Red Ball Express drivers endured, not occasionally, routinely. The standard run for a Red Ball driver was from Normandy to a forward supply depot. Depending on where the front line was, this could be 200 to 400 miles. Then immediately turn around and drive back. No rest at the destination. Maybe grab a quick meal while the truck was being loaded. Maybe catch 20 minutes of sleep while waiting for paperwork. Then back on the road. A round trip could take 20 to 24 hours, depending on road conditions and distance. Then you'd arrive back at the starting point, and often there would be another load waiting. The demand for supplies was insatiable. Every hour mattered, so drivers would turn around and make another run. Some drivers did this for days at a stretch. Private First Class Jimmy Johnson, a driver from Mississippi, later described a typical stretch. "I drove from Sunday morning to Tuesday night without more than maybe 2 hours total sleep. You'd pull into the depot, they'd start loading your truck, and you'd crawl into the cab and pass out. 10 minutes later, someone's banging on the door. You're loaded, move out. So you'd start driving again. After a while, you couldn't even remember what day it was. The army tried to enforce rest periods. Regulations said drivers should have 8 hours off between shifts, but the regulations couldn't override reality. There weren't enough trucks, there weren't enough drivers, and there was no end to the demand for supplies. So the drivers kept driving. The methods they used to stay awake varied. Some smoked constantly. Cigarettes and coffee were the primary fuel. Some sang at the top of their lungs to keep themselves alert. Some would slap themselves hard whenever they felt their eyes closing. Medics distributed amphetamines, pep pill or go pills, stimulants that would keep you awake but left you jittery, paranoid, and eventually made the crash even worse. Many drivers took them. What choice did they have? Fall asleep and crash, potentially killing yourself and destroying critical supplies? Or take the pills and keep driving? The accidents were inevitable. Drivers would fall asleep at the wheel and drift off the road. Trucks would collide because exhausted drivers couldn't react fast enough. Some drivers died in crashes, others were injured. The trucks themselves were driven so hard that mechanical failures were constant. Blown engine, broken axle, burned out clutches. But the convoys kept rolling. Here's what kept them going. They knew what was at stake. Every truck that reached the front lines meant American soldiers had ammunition to fight, fuel to advance, food to eat. Every truck that didn't make it meant soldiers went without. And there was something else, a sense of pride that bordered on defiance. These men had been told their entire lives that they weren't as capable as white men, that they lacked the intelligence, the discipline, the endurance. Now they were doing something that white soldiers couldn't or wouldn't do. They were proving every single day that the racism they'd faced was a lie. Sergeant George Crockett, a driver from Detroit, put it this way: "They didn't think we could fight. Fine. We'll show them we can outwork anybody. We'll drive until we drop. We'll move more supplies than they thought possible. And when this war is over, they won't be able to say we didn't do our part." The statistics bear this out. During the Red Ball Express's 83 days of operation, over 6,000 vehicles operated continuously, 412,000 tons of supplies, delivered average distance per run, 600 plus miles round trip, average delivery rate, 12,500 tons per day at peak operation. Some individual drivers logged over 20,000 miles in 3 months, equivalent to driving across the United States 7 times. The human cost is harder to quantify. How many accidents? How many injuries? How much long-term health damage from sleep deprivation and chronic stress? The Army didn't keep detailed records of non-combat casualties among service units, but the veterans remembered. In interviews conducted decades later, many Red Ball Express drivers talked about the physical toll, chronic back problems from the brutal rides, hearing damage from the constant engine noise, lingering sleep disorders, and something that wouldn't have a name until much later, PTSD, from the relentless stress and exhaustion. One veteran said, "People think you get PTSD from combat, but let me tell you, driving for 20 hours straight, so tired you're hallucinating, knowing that if you crash you might die or kill someone else, doing that day after day after day. That leaves scars too, just different kind." The thing is, the Red Ball Express drivers had a choice. Technically, they could have refused excessive shifts. They could have reported unsafe conditions. They could have slowed down, taken breaks, followed regulations, but they didn't, because they knew what would happen if they did. The advance would stop. Patton's army would run out of fuel. The Germans would have time to regroup and fortify. The war would drag on. More American soldiers would die. So they kept driving. 72 hours, 48 hours, 36 hours, whatever it took. They drove when their hands shook so badly they could barely grip the steering wheel. They drove when they couldn't remember the last time they'd had a real meal. They drove when exhaustion made them weep from frustration. They drove because stopping wasn't an option. And they did it knowing that the history books probably wouldn't remember them, that the credit would go to Patton and his tanks, to the infantry, to the generals, that most Americans would never know that 6,000 black truck drivers had kept the war machine running. They did it anyway, because the mission mattered more than recognition, because proving themselves mattered more than comfort, because they refused to be the reason the advance failed. 72 hours without sleep. It shouldn't be humanly possible, but for the Red Ball Express, it was just another run. September 1944. Patton's Third Army is advancing again. After being stalled for nearly 2 weeks in late August, fuel and ammunition are flowing. Tanks that were sitting immobile are roaring back to life. Artillery batteries that had been rationing shells are firing full barrages. Infantry units that had been on half rations are eating regular meals. The advance resumes. By mid-September, Patton's forces have crossed the Moselle River. By late September, they're fighting on German soil for the first time. The Third Army captures Metz, breaches the Siegfried Line, and pushes toward the Rhine. None of this would have been possible without the Red Ball Express. Let me give you the numbers that make this clear. In August 1944, before the Red Ball Express began operations, the U.S. Army in France was receiving about 7,000 tons of supplies per day. This wasn't enough to support sustained offensive operations. Armies were competing for scarce resources. Patton's Third Army, furthest from the Normandy beaches, was getting the short end. By early September, with the Red Ball Express in full operation, daily supply deliveries had increased to over 20,000 tons. By late September, peak Red Ball operations were moving 12,500 tons per day just on the Red Ball routes alone, with thousands more tons moving through other supply channels that the Red Ball had made more efficient by clearing the main highways. This increase, from 7,000 to 20,000 plus tons daily, was the difference between a stalled army and an advancing army. Patton knew this. He visited Red Ball Express depots multiple times. He made a point of thanking the drivers personally. In one documented instance, Patton stood on a platform and addressed a group of Red Ball drivers. "Your work has been the key to my success. I couldn't have done what I've done without you. You've kept my army moving, and because of that, we're winning this war." This wasn't just Patton being diplomatic. The Third Army's own logistics reports make it clear. The Red Ball Express was critical to sustained operation. Without it, the Third Army would have been immobilized for weeks, possibly months, waiting for the supply system to catch up. And here's what makes this even more significant. The Red Ball Express didn't just support Patton. It supported multiple Allied armies: British forces under Montgomery, American forces under Bradley and Hodd, Canadian units. The entire Allied advance through France in fall 1944 depended on the supplies the Red Ball moved. German commanders noticed. Captured intelligence documents from fall 1944 show that German officers were baffled by American logistics. One German general's report, captured later, read, "The American supply system operates at a scale and speed that seems impossible. Our intelligence cannot explain how they move such quantities so far so quickly." They couldn't explain it because the Red Ball Express was doing things that logistics textbooks said couldn't be done. The Army's own logistics manuals, written before the war, calculated maximum sustainable supply transport based on normal operating procedures: regulated work hours, maintenance schedules, rest periods, proper traffic control. The Red Ball Express threw out the textbook. It worked men and machines beyond sustainable limits. It accepted high casualty rates for vehicles. Trucks were driven until they broke down, then abandoned or cannibalized for parts. It pushed drivers to the edge of human endurance. It was unsustainable in the long term. But the Army didn't need long term. They needed 3 months of maximum output to capitalize on the German collapse in France. The Red Ball Express gave them exactly that. By November 1944, the situation had changed. Allied forces had captured the port of Antwerp. Supply lines were shorter. More trucks and drivers had arrived. The desperate crisis of August-September was over. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially ceased operation. The Red Ball signs came down. The dedicated highways returned to normal traffic. The drivers were reassigned to regular transport duties. In 83 days, the Red Ball Express had moved 412,000 tons of supplies, operated over 6,000 vehicles, driven an estimated 5 million miles collectively, kept multiple Allied armies supplied through the crucial fall offensive. The cost: dozens of drivers killed in accidents, hundreds injured, thousands of vehicles worn out or destroyed, uncounted cases of exhaustion, illness, and stress-related injuries. But the result, the Allied advance, didn't stop. Germany didn't get time to recover. The war in Europe was won by May 1945, less than 9 months after the Red Ball Express began operations. Military historians debate how much credit the Red Ball Express deserves for Allied victory. Some argue it was just one part of a larger logistics system. Others contend it was the decisive factor that allowed the Allies to maintain momentum when momentum mattered most. What's not debatable is this: Patton himself said he couldn't have done it without them. The Third Army's records show critical dependence on Red Ball supplies. And the timing is clear. When the red ball was operating, the advance continued. When it wasn't, armies stalled. The Red Ball Express proved something that military strategists have understood ever since. Amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. All the brilliant generalship, all the brave infantry, all the powerful tanks in the world don't matter if you can't keep them supplied. The men who won World War II in Europe weren't just the soldiers who fired the guns, they were the drivers who kept the bullets coming. And 3/4 of those drivers were black men, who the army had said weren't capable of combat. They proved their capability in a different way. They proved that endurance, determination, and excellence in your assigned role matter just as much as heroism in combat. They proved that Patton's secret weapon wasn't his tanks, it was them.